Syria! Syria! It starts with talking about deporting criminals, but it does not stop. This is just the beginning.
Germany must not be a safe haven for dangerous persons or serious criminals.
On December 31st, 2020, the general ban on deportation from Syria to Germany expired. The ban has been in place since 2012 and for 8 years was extended because of the ongoing instability and violence occurring in Syria. Legally, the discontinuation of this ban means that convicted criminals and individuals that threaten public safety can effectively be deported back to Syria. This could potentially make Germany the first country in the EU to deport Syrian refugees. The lifting of this ban has been opposed by thousands of Syrian refugees living in Germany. This opposition has taken the form of the #SyriaNotSafe movement. The interior ministers of Germany's state governments argue that the lifting of this ban will only affect a small number of serious offenders, but protesters feel that this will evolve to negatively impact the lives of many Syrian refugees residing in Germany. Before unpacking this debate between these two parties, it is important to understand the context behind this discussion, namely the history of the Syrian refugee crisis and the tensions in Germany that led to this ban being lifted. After several decades of being under the rule of authoritarian governments, the populations of several Middle Eastern countries ousted their leaders in a collective phenomenon known as the Arab Spring movement. This included countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, which all underwent brief uprisings that resulted in shifts in power. This refers to movements like the 28-day revolution of Tunisia and the death of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Like other countries of this region, the citizens of Syria sought liberation from the oppressive regime of President Bashar al-Assad. At the beginning of his rule, there was an expectation for democratic reform and revival of the economy to occur, as was promised in his inaugural address. He followed through on this to some extent by lifting restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and releasing hundreds of political prisoners. These reforms form part of a phenomenon known as the Damascus Spring, a short-lived period of toleration and political reform in the Middle Eastern region.
It's simple yet impossible. It's simple because the solution is very clear.
Assad stated that economic reform needed to occur before political and social reform could, and therefore placed restrictions on freedom of expression and press, just months after these restrictions had initially been lifted. Tensions existed between the US and Syria, because Syria supported Palestinian and Lebanese groups which opposed the Israeli forces supported by the US. This harmed Syria's Western relations and left its economy isolated.
Don't want to stop sending all kind of support to those terrorists. So if we start with stopping this logistical support and as Syrians go to dialogue, talk about constitution, about the future.
In addition to this, Assad's economic liberalization largely benefited private industries and the political elites, while the public sector, which the majority of Syrians depended on, did not receive the same report. This lack of economic reform and increased repression ultimately led to the Syrian war, which, like the other movements of the Arab Spring, began in 2011. Protests spread across the country, increasing in magnitude as the movement gained momentum. Assad responded to this by sending armed forces to stop these demonstrations. They opened fire on demonstrators, killing hundreds of civilians and arresting thousands. Armed opposition groups began to appear after this response and lay attacks against the Syrian army. The war between the rebel groups and the Syrian army is still ongoing. Over 500,000 Syrians lost their lives during this war, and 6.8 million have fled Syria to become refugees and asylum seekers in other countries. Of these millions of refugees, 5.5 million live in Syria's neighboring countries Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. Approximately 65% of refugees that live between the neighboring countries reside in Turkey. This means that Turkey hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees in the world. On a global scale, 5% of Syrian refugees live in refugee camps, and 70% live below the poverty line of the countries they have settled in. It is estimated that approximately 800,000 Syrian refugees reside in Germany as of 2021. It hosts the largest population of Syrian refugees of all the EU countries. In 2015, German Chancellor Angela Merkel initiated Germany's open-door migration policy.
Abschottung im 21. Jahrhundert des Internet.
Shutting the borders in the 21st century of the internet era is an illusion.
This policy gave way for approximately 500,000 immigrants to seek asylum in Germany and enter its borders through the Balkan route, a route through Hungary to Germany used by many refugees from the Middle Eastern countries. Merkel's policy and this route allowed refugees entry into Germany before seeking asylum, only requiring them to seek asylum after they had crossed the border. It worked in contrast to the Dublin Agreement, which detailed that asylum seekers must register in the first safe EU country that they enter. By 2016, however, the number of immigrants applying for asylum in Germany dropped significantly. This was caused mainly by the countries along the Balkan route placing harsher restrictions on their borders. Responses to the open-door migration policy had been divisive amongst German citizens. In December 2019, a study conducted by Amnesty International found that 40% of German citizens viewed the large numbers of Syrian refugees as a threat to German public safety, while 60% did not. Merkel's policy was repealed in 2018 because of several threats to national security that occurred. The German government said that these attacks led to their decision to discontinue the general ban on deportation, making it possible to deport criminals and threats to public safety. The most relevant examples of such threats include a Syrian man being sentenced to 6 years in jail after plotting a car bomb which prosecutors say he intended to kill up to 200 people with. In 2016, a Syrian who had been denied asylum used a suicide bomb near a music festival in Ansbach, a town in South Germany. In 2017, 6 Syrian migrants were arrested by the German police because of alleged links to ISIS. There are currently 90 Syrian refugees being held by the German government that are seen as threats to public safety with, quote, Islamist backgrounds.
We know from previous experiences like the Afghanis that the minute deportation, the door for deportation is open, everyone is a fair game.
The concern of Syrian refugees against this ban being lifted is a repetition of the events that occurred when this ban was lifted for Afghanis. In 2013, the average number of deportations to Afghanistan was 8 people per year. These numbers began to increase in 2016, so that by 2019, the average amount of refugees deported per year was at 361, multiplying by approximately 4,500%. Germany does not currently have the diplomatic relations to the Syrian government under Assad, or an effective system of transportation to manage deportations of the same magnitude to Syria. So on one hand, we have a government hosting the largest amount of Syrian refugees of any country in its region, concerned about the impact this may have on public safety. And on the other hand, we have Syrian refugees, most of which are not criminals or threats to public safety, that face the fear of being sent back to an unstable region where their lives would be at risk. These refugees also distrust the German-led prosecution of Syrian criminals that would determine these deportations. We are then left with the question of what possible solutions there are that would benefit and ensure the safety of both parties.
We're going to build a wall. It's going to be built. It's not even, believe it or not, it's not even a difficult thing to do.
Okay, definitely not that, but it might actually help to look at solutions practiced in other countries to resolve this. The ban has already presently been discontinued, so what we should be looking to do is ensuring that it is replaced with a policy that will fairly decide the fate of Syrian refugees and calm the German government's concerns about public safety. In 1995, South Africa practiced a justice model called the Truth and Reconciliation Court, which incentivized perpetrators of apartheid to admit their past crimes and potentially receive amnesty or concessions with jail time depending on the extent of their crime. This effort was led by human rights lawyers and was aimed at ensuring that victims and their families would have access to truth about past crimes. I am proposing that Germany adopts a collaborative court system in partnership with Syrian refugees that would assist in fairly identifying potential threats. The current status quo in Germany is that the fate of refugees is decided on a case-by-case basis. I am proposing that this case-by-case system is maintained, but in each case, there should be a jury present, with a quota detailing that 50% of those serving on this jury are Syrian asylum holders, while the other 50% are German citizens. In this way, German citizens are able to actively participate in ensuring their own safety, and cases can be assessed by a community of Syrians with a nuanced understanding of the background of those being prosecuted. The cases will be mediated by the existing judges that serve in Germany's current judicial system. The fate of the prosecuted will be determined by the jury. The result that this would hopefully have is mitigating a repeat of the rapid increase of deportations seen with the Afghani refugees. This concession could also work to reduce the tensions and the divisions between the Syrian protesters and the German government. Furthermore, it has potential to assist with integrating Syrian immigrants into German society. To further ensure that the numbers of Syrian refugees being deported remains controlled, I propose placing a fixed maximum amount of deportees per year. This maximum would ensure that it is only extreme threats to society that are deported, as opposed to those convicted of petty offenses. These steps would ensure that the Syrian refugees deported remains limited to serious offenders that pose a danger to the lives of German citizens and other Syrian refugees alike. The next step is determining what to do with prosecuted Syrians found to be threats to public safety, in the absence of effective relations between the German and Syrian governments. For this, I propose Germany relating to Syria through Russia, a country with better lines of communication with the Syrian government. A limited number of deportees means that transporting Syrian refugees through Russia could be more attainable because a small group of people can easily be controlled. The general ban on deportation
On the floor
to Syria
below,
from
in the
Germany
reeking
by no
bowels of the
means is a
station,
simplistic issue.
I meet
But
Maysoon
my
and
hope is
Maraf,
that these
a
are
mother
steps
and
in the
daughter
right
duo from
direction
Aleppo.
to justly addressing this contentious subject.